Hello and welcome to Portraits of Greatness. This is episode 5, I believe, where we're on Emerson's Representative Men and Swedenborg, or the Mystic.
Yeah,
This
the most
might be a little
popular
bit of,
man in the entire essay.
might be
Everybody knows
a little
about
bit
him.
shorter
So
considering his
much.
life of the Mystic, but I think we can flesh it out to understand like why would Emerson choose a mystic? Mysticism seems almost something so foreign to us today, something more difficult to grasp with. So I think there still might be a benefit to going through it, analyzing more from a broader mystical sense than Swedenborg necessarily his life and times. So in that context, how did you find this, Rashid? Especially considering we did Plato last. So where does a philosopher end and a mystic begin, sort of thing, is an interesting take.
So, yeah, interestingly, he did make this essay immediately follow Plato. And he does talk about many of the subjects that he mentioned previously in Plato, not just as, existing, but just sort of defining the faults of Plato himself. Not Swedenborg, but Emerson goes into, at the very last few paragraphs within his essays, always into the faults of the person he's talking about, which we'll get into more in the third part of this episode. But as we will read in Swedenborg, Swedenborg in many ways exemplifies things that Emerson felt like Plato should have had, and someone who is going to be talking about truth and moral, especially moral truths within society must have, such as absolute conviction in their own ideas. And it's very interesting that he starts the essay with literally making the distinction between philosophers and what he thinks is a mystic, as Swedenborg is. So he makes a distinction, not just philosophers and mystics, but also poets, because he feels like poetry also goes into what mysticism exemplifies. So I will quickly quote one of the first paragraphs of the essay to make my point, and I'll explain it further. So he says, a higher class in the estimation and love of the city, building market going race of mankind, are the poets, who, from the intellectual kingdom, feed the thoughts and imaginations with ideas and pictures, which raise men out of the world of corn and money, and console them for the shortcomings of the day and the meanness of labor and traffic. Then also the philosopher has his value, who flatters the intellect of this laborer by engaging him with subtleties which instruct them in new faculties. Others may build cities. He is to understand them and keep them in awe. But there is a class who lead us into another region. He's talking about the mystics here. The world of morals and of will. What is singular about this region of thought is its claim. Wherever the sentiment of right comes in, it takes precedence of everything else. For other things, I make poetry of them, but the moral sentiment makes poetry of me. So these people who are going into moral sentiments, in Emerson's view, and in Emerson's view in general, are the people that are basically have similarities to poets in that poets are also dealing with day-to-day troubles, as he mentioned, with the traffic and the meanness of labor and sort. But he says that while poets may sort of like indirectly talk about them and indirectly confront them, and mostly be vague about the subject, in mostly open for interpretation, as the reader is supposed to interact with the poetry. The mystic, the person, the prophet or the saint, will confront it directly. He will not hide it within words. He will immediately attack it, and he will make basically sweeping gestures that will make it clear what exactly he thinks is right and wrong. In that way, it's like poetry, but it doesn't need subtlety in a sort of manner, because it directly confronts the subject. And while Emerson is not like trying to make Swedenborg as this big prophet, he doesn't use the word prophet a lot, even though he does say at one point of the
it's
essay,
very rare.
he's trying to create a new religion. He actually says this in a quote.
I think Swedenborg was trying to create a new religion.
Yeah,
I think he was.
Really
it was more than just sort of a vague mysticism.
But yeah, this is how he starts it.
He
starts it by saying that the poet sort of consoles the man. The philosopher keeps them in awe and also explains the world to them, and also like make them see the world in a new light. But the mystic takes a direct approach. The mystic makes moral judgments. I mean, that's kind of the difference.
He associates morality with the mystic, which seems a little strange. Like you still have the Nicomachean ethics. In Aristotle, you have philosophers trying to understand ethical boundaries and ethical means. So I think today that morality that Emerson prescribes entirely to a mystic here is actually much more bound up in philosophy. So it's sort of that morality piece of mysticism has come into philosophy in modern age, but it's all of the other stuff about mysticism is just kind of tankered. It's completely collapsed. Like it's so foreign to us. But I also did notice like the way he started there. It was interesting, first of all, unashamedly going into a caste class structure. There are laborers, they produce, and otherwise they kind of know nothing. And the intellectual, the intellectual kingdom, the poet, the philosopher, need to give them everything. Almost like the producer just goes through his day. Was it like he doesn't invent the loom? He just goes through and uses it. So Emerson really wasn't afraid to create a class structure and have poets and philosophers at the top. Again, kind of why he was happy to go with Plato in the last one, in the Republic, of having like the philosopher as king. I think a lot of that Emerson finds quite enticing. But yeah, the philosopher in Emerson's mind seems much more, that's why he chose Plato rather than Aristotle, I think, as well. Plato is, as you say, he shies away from the ultimate judgment. A lot of his stuff is just dialogues with Socrates, who's just questioning everything. It's the constant critique of something. I think he calls Montaigne the skeptic in his next lecture, but there's this skepticism to Socrates and Emerson's idea of the philosopher as well. So when he puts the mystic in as it's almost like he wants it to be above the philosopher, but he's kind of inhibited a little bit. He knows it's a little bit absurd to put it there. He doesn't want to kind of, I don't know. I feel like he's lacking a little bit in conviction. Do you feel that, Emerson? When he's trying to place the mystic in this hierarchy?
Lacks conviction. How? Like he doesn't.
He thinks it should be above a philosopher almost, but because they're so meant to be in tune with the spiritual world. But I think he lacks the conviction in saying they are.
Well, Emerson has a tendency to actually put whatever he's talking about at the moment above everything else while he's talking about them. He has a very bombastic style of writing, which makes like the thing he talks about your only focus within while you're reading the passage that he's writing. I bet when we're talking about skepticism, we'll think he's putting skeptics above every poet or philosopher as well. I think if we were to see the whole essay all together, I think we would understand that he's not actually putting one above the other, because he still hasn't started talking about the poet, for instance, but the poet is almost like put down in this essay, almost completely, like he's saying that poets
not as much as the laborer.
Yeah, the laborer is the constant punching bag of Emerson.
Yeah.
Someone should tell Emerson that, when he goes and talks to, he goes and gives his speeches to laborers, they don't really understand it.
They might take it the wrong way.
Basically, he's almost putting down poets, but I know for a fact that Emerson does not view poetry as this lesser art. He's just trying to make the distinction between them, and he is actually picking the one part he thinks the mysticism does more efficiently, or like more solidly almost than what poets do. And yeah, if you look through the entire essay, I think you will see that Emerson has a lot of sort of criticism on not just Swedenborg, but of the idea of mysticism itself. I think this is the only essay where Emerson gives like a cautionary advice to his readers about what they're reading.
Oh yeah, that was
we'll get to that in
piece.
the second part.
Yeah.
Yeah, but basically the caste structure only exists so that Emerson can, in my opinion, as how I read it, the caste structure exists so that Emerson can talk about what mysticism has, as opposed to poetry and basically philosophy. Mysticism is also almost like this indirect way of mentioning what are prophets doing, because he mentions Quran quite a bit. I don't think
there's
he
a bit of
the Old Testament and the New Testament.
There's a bit of that pull to Carlyle's second lecture here as well. You can feel it. I also think as well the Brahmins are high on his mind. He's thinking of them when he thinks of the intellectual kingdom of Plato. He then wants to become a worldly person, right? This naturalist approach. He wants to understand the Hindus, and then he sees that they have this Brahmin class, this priestly class who protect the sacred, and he sees that maybe slightly differently to Plato, where he already put Plato, but he wants them in his intellectual kingdom. So he finds Western versions of them, and he finds a sort of Swedenborg, and goes, "This guy kind of is like that." And he also compares the transmigration, this sort of reincarnation, to later he brings in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and says that was like a pagan version of trying to do the same thing that the Hindus are talking about, which I thought was quite interesting. So I think he's always trying to come up with a naturalist approach, which sometimes means he's going to parallel someone a bit odd like Swedenborg with the Brahmin caste.
I think his transmigration of the soul comes from a Greek philosopher. I don't remember it. It's either Aristotle or like Plato. But yeah,
well, he uses the word transmigration in relation to the Brahmins.
Yeah, but he sort of like tries to create this link between the philosophy of like reincarnation through the philosophy of what you would call sort of through like ancient Greek philosophy of the soul being separate and leaving the body. So yeah, he does say like this Swedenborg person was trying to universalize almost everything, and he had this knack for Swedenborg had a knack for just taking unrelated fields and unrelated ideas within completely different fields and putting them together in trying to explain nature. And in that way, he's saying that in this way that Swedenborg sort of differentiates himself from science. Science is usually not trying to make a direct link between social science within one particular field and then like quantum mechanics in another, unless you're like Deepak Chopra. You know that guy?
Yeah. No, I don't know.
He's one of those weird philosopher types, like social media. Who's almost like trying to just read quantum physics and then say, so this relates to what you feel in your heart when you have a breakup.
Okay.
He's that type of guy. And there are really funny videos on YouTube where like actual physicists confront him with what he was saying, because he's sort of like quoting the physicist, and then the physicist who was quoted comes to Deepak Chopra and says, you quoted me in relation to how people deal with breakups, but if you looked at the exact science of my writing, it's not like that.
But I actually think that's exactly what Emerson's getting at. I mean, strip away the social media element. He is talking about science against mysticism already. It's still more branches of a singular field, because physics still comes from natural philosophy at this point in Emerson's life. But yeah, he's thinking that Swedenborg was a scientist first. I think he was an engineer, worked closely with the Swedish monarchy back at a time where 18th century Swedish monarchy, like, it was a pretty big European power. It wasn't when it was this mild offshoot. of neutrality or so on. So he's working in a pretty decent court, decent milieu as an engineer, getting a reputation of building certain infrastructure. I'm not sure what it was about, mining, this sort of stuff. But yeah, he even mentions like, oh, he produced Daedalus Hyperboreus, which is some sort of engineering scientific degree. And Emerson's trying to push it this, like, he was a good scientist, believe me.
Yeah, he does use that a lot to like sort of amp up his resume, the guy's resume, to like, you know, he always.
When I get to the mystic bit, remember he was a good scientist, rather than he was always a quack or something.
He says like he started this stuff at 54. Before that, he was just a scientist.
Is his revelation, his ecstasy, or his the mystic experiences.
Yeah, he says that before then he was always going into practical sciences. He was always trying to tinker with things to make them work. And he was he boasted up his resume quite a bit. He worked with these guys. He fixed these problems with ships and
he's really trying to keep you as reader on side, I think, almost to a fault. It's kind of like, why are you trying so hard, Emerson? It shouldn't be this hard. You know, he knows we'll be skeptical, I think, or something. But he does mention trances. Trances, he claims Socrates, Plotinus, Porphyry all had them. Pascal, another one who went from the scientist into the mystic piece. I probably would have been better if he used Pascal than Swedenborg, I think. But he's trying to say, no, this was still science, but he seems comfortable enough that I think it's a bit tangentious, but that there's this line, there's this history of people having these trances. I don't know if you can link Socrates to Swedenborg in that way. It felt a little bit ham-fisted. I don't know if you felt that.
A lot of what this essay feels ham-fisted because it has that same problem as Muhammad essay that Carlyle had written. That Carlyle tries to fit everything Muhammad did and lived through and his philosophy within one 29-page essay. And Emerson tries to do that with Swedenborg, and that's sort of the fault of this essay, in my opinion, because he fits in so many things. There are things from this weird notion that he's talking about in Swedenborg's writing, where Swedenborg says, like, if 1 out of every 30,000 men ate his shoes and married his grandmother, that means 1 out of 30,000 men eat their shoes and marries their grandmothers. The sort of pattern that he sees in nature. And there are also other parts where he's talking about body parts and anatomy in a poetic sense, that it can actually be, you know, sort of like this idea that scientific facts can be poeticized. And a great deal of what he's talking about in Swedenborg's mysticism sort of relies on this idea that you can, you know, through your moral authority, replace scientific facts with religious facts and still have a coherent narrative. And this, in my opinion, kind of sounds like Christian apologetics. What do you think? It's this kind of idea that,
I think a 20th century version of this was Rudolf Steiner. I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's sort of he straddles the late 19th, early 20th century. He tried to say he could create like a mystery, again, like Swedenborg. He thought he was in communion with angels and devils and all sorts. But he was a respected philosopher before that. I don't think so much a scientist, but more a philosopher. With metaphysics kind of overcame him too much. And he was it, I'm going to get this wrong, anthroposophy or something. He tried to, anthroposophy, I'm going to call it that. He tried to create his own field of like, I'm going to do mysticism, but we're going to do it with the rigor of a scientist. Which is kind of what you're talking about, like place religion into molds that, I just think it's an interesting one, because I kind of agree with where Emerson's coming from at the start when he's talking about 17th century, 16th century scientific discoveries. Think of like Harvey knowing the circulation of the blood. I think he lists a few others. Newton's gravity. He compares Newton's gravity to like metaphysics can also find a gravity, which I'm willing to give him certain rope on. Let's just hope it's not rope to hang himself. But,
okay.
there is a truth to be found in metaphysics. I don't think it's completely bunk. Aristotle does write a treatise on metaphysics as well as doing ethics and physics, and Newton himself was a very spiritual man. So there, yeah, you can look at the scientific enlightenment from that lens, that they're, and this is the Emersonian lens, we're probing nature, we're understanding nature. Nature's still this kind of thing that you can be in awe of, and you understand its systems a bit more by probing at it. And I think that's how we see 17th century scientific enlightenment. So from there, it's not too much of a leap to get to a Swedenborg, whereas now the scientist is not, I don't know, it doesn't feel like they're probing nature almost. They're almost becoming quite dogmatic in like their approach to how they're finding out things. The scientists, they would not give any, I can think of like a laboratory scientist, there's no space for metaphysics anymore in it. So from that perspective, I think don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm kind of with Emerson, but he probably even goes a bit too far for me. Maybe it's just my age. The age at which I live, I can't kind of tap into the same realm of thought. But you can see where he's coming from. Science as something that probes nature. Swedenborg wanted to probe all of nature as well. And then from there, we can enter mysticism. It's sort of a way for the modern man to enter, I think.
Yeah, it's very interesting that he makes that comparison with like how a mystic views nature and interprets it in a scientific manner, with like this poetic tale about a snake and a man's ribs, sort of. I'll just quote it quickly. There's a very quick story about how a snake and sort of shapes within the body create this poetry, in which a poetic anatomist, he says, I found a quote, a poetic anatomist in our own day teaches that a snake, being a horizontal line, and a man, being an erect line, constitute a right angle. And between the lines of this mystical quadrant, all animated beings find their place, and he assumes the hairworm, the spanworm, or the snake as the type or prediction of the spine. So he's trying to like explain. This goes on for like a whole 2 paragraphs. By the way, I'm not going to read the whole thing, or else we'll be here longer than 45 minutes. But he's explaining all of these different shapes within the natural world as relating to these few shapes, and how that sort of poetically means as in relation to man and man's relations with nature. And he sort of makes that similarity between how mysticism sort of starts interpreting nature and interpreting the natural sciences, as opposed to how a scientist would. He says that this is how scientists in his own day, sort of a poetic scientist, he says, a poetic anatomist, interprets the forms and the repeating. I think of
Goethe a lot when I think of this.
And it's also very important to actually, I think, from this quote and from what I've learned from like reading, I read a bit of William James's biography. You're familiar with him, right?
Yeah.
So William James's biography, and at the time, he was learning to be a doctor, but the kind of information given to doctors at the time was very, very basic compared to what is given right now. And not just because like it was the 1800s, but it was the kind of profession only like layman did. Sort of like you took a 2-year college course on it, and you didn't even need to like have anything other than give them money to be in it. Anyhow, what was taught to them in those very quick courses were basically stuff like what Emerson is saying here. The natural sciences were always sort of interpreted in a much more poetic or just sort of layman manner than we are accustomed to it now, even within our grade school system. A grade school might have very simple explanations for how this human body works, but it wouldn't try to make allegories or like try to explain it in sweeping gestures, such as a rib sort of gives the notion of how the bones in the foot and the toes are functioned. And he actually makes those remarks in here. Emerson makes those remarks. And it's important to think that at the time, like in the, especially like anatomical and medical sciences of those days, a much more interpretive approach to medical sciences was being taken. So in a way, it wasn't even that separated from each other if you look at it within the context of its time. And yeah, that's what thing I noticed from reading some of the medical analysis that Emerson talks about in this chapter, and the relation between mysticism. You could actually hear the sound of water there quite well.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. I don't know at what point the textbook loses, like the grade school textbook. It does lose something though, like because people then just, you know, they learn this sort of stuff to regurgitate it for exam purposes, rather than as you know, in a living world sort of experience, which I think is more what Swedenborg and Goethe and Emerson all would have lived more in this milieu, whether they disagree with each other or not. It was not like textbook. It was not textbook style, exam style, just pass this to get your profession. It was much more, let's investigate ourselves with the world. And I think to that extent, I called out here that Emerson says the colossal soul can obtain an element of omnipresence, almost like demigodery. And I think he calls out old Greek myths who are deemed to be demigods in Crete and so on later in the essay. He says that, you know, they can become omnipresent with nature through unbelievable understanding. And he gives examples of Aristotle, Bacon, and Humboldt, which I think is quite interesting. I think it is definitely different to the scientist of today, particularly the physicist, who our understanding of physics now, when we're probing the boundaries of physics, it's so far away from anything that we perceive in our everyday lives, because it's either the scale is either quantum or it's enormous. It's on the galactic scale or interstellar scale.
They're not as directly involved with our own lives as you just immediately read them. In the educational system that I was talking about, people are directly involved because the type of examples and the type of writing style that they choose is one where you can immediately make a connection. It's kind of like the measurement of a foot as opposed to a measurement of a centimeter. A foot is something you can actually visualize, but a centimeter is much more abstract.
Exactly. That's quite interesting. And a lot of that coming in with the French Enlightenment, the French Revolution. I think he does call out that while he's skeptical, probably the wrong word, while he disagrees with Swedenborg's idea, he calls it far too Hebraic, as in when Swedenborg eventually has these revelations, it's very much already in the Christian mold and biblical idea of heaven and hell, rather than what Emerson thinks should be. It should be something that you become all-encompassing, the state of ecstasy,
universal,
trance. You become so commune with nature that you shouldn't be able to describe it in these terms of like, oh, I visited this angel and he had this specific conversation with me. At that point, Emerson's like, nah, Swedenborg, you're talking complete nonsense. But I think he still will go further. He'll critique the French for being like, your reason isn't good enough. You're creating the meter or whatever. I think he would have enjoyed the foot or the hands, measuring a horse in hands and that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
Anything that could be brought back to a natural element.
Yeah, that's why United States is still very adamant about not going into the metric system.
It's simply because of Emerson.
Maybe. Who knows?
Yeah, he tried to link this back to Plato as well in the last one. Do you remember where Plato was bisecting the world into different parts? Some of them was the perceived part. And I was a bit confused in the last one what was going on. I think it's from the 6th book of the Republic. But I understood it a bit more when he was going on about it here. It's the analogy of the divided line. It's also used in the Timaeus, where he divides the world and then he divides the smaller bit of the world ever more in halves. So you're left with like A to B being the lowest is likeness of visible things, and then you get visible things, and then you're ascending upwards to geometry and number, and then eventually you get up to like truth, which is God. So it's like different further iterations away from the pure idea, Platonic idea. So that kind of links back with how Emerson was trying to create a hierarchy at the very beginning. Where does the mystic go in this hierarchy? He sees Plato's bisections of the lines analogous to where a mystic should be in the bisection of life, where with the laborers at the bottom, poets here. Now, again, you say he might change that in the next essay when he's talking about.
Oh, he definitely will. I mean, he already breaks one of his most cherished thoughts of what you would call interpreting a reading material or a writing material, which I'll talk about right after I mention that. What he talked about in relation to how he makes the caste system, and in the last essay he was talking about how Plato wasn't willing to go into the sort of assertive mode where he would actually try to solidify his thoughts, and that's what he actually says mystics do. He says that mystics actually try to solidify their thoughts and try to make the sort of logical leap to. And he says like there's a paradox, because he says that you have to, in a sort of manner, abandon logic in order to create these sweeping statements. But then he says that in a way that when you abandon logic and then also try to explain it in a logical manner, as Swedenborg does, you become a sort of, it becomes a paradox, and in a sort of way you become a hypocrite when you're trying to explain the natural world in statements that are very solid and unchanging. And he actually disagrees with a lot of the statements, which is, this is a habit of Emerson's with his with his approach to great man theory. It's not something he apologizes for. I know some of Carlyle's students who also took on the great man theory and started talking about the people they thought as great men, would have like an apology section where they talked about the faults of the people they were discussing. They were saying that, these people had these faults, but, knowing them is kind of important. Emerson doesn't even do that. He just sort of starts exalting the person at the beginning and then immediately goes into what he thinks are the faults within his works. And he thinks that Swedenborg's biggest fault was that, as far as, he tried to be a prophet, and obviously he tried to make very solid statements about good and evil. For instance, according to Swedenborg, apparently an evil was from nature evil. He was not something that was either like created or something that could be redeemed. Sort of this.
Yes, and he quotes Euripides later on, Emerson does, saying that he's in agreement with Euripides, which I found a bit strange. He doesn't believe that there can be this thing that is evil. Emerson doesn't, whereas Swedenborg did.
Yeah, Emerson thinks that all things are going to good, and
this is a progressive tendency.
Quote. Yeah, goodness and being in gods are one, he says. He who imputes ill to them makes them none. To what a painful perversion has Gothic theology arrived, that Swedenborg admitted no conversion for evil spirits. But the divine effort is never relaxed. The carrion and the sun will convert itself to grass and flowers. And man, though in brothels or jails or on gibbets, is on his way to all that is good and true. So this is a direct quote from the essay, and this is sort of what Emerson objects to in Swedenborg, is that evil is not in nature, and that evil is something that is continually being assaulted by the good, and everyone is eventually on their way to the to good. Yeah, it is a more progressive.
It's progressive, but they almost I get when Swedenborg says he's talking to devils. That's to our minds completely absurd, and even by the 18th century, which I think is why he picked Swedenborg rather than some earlier mystic. He picked Swedenborg because he lived in the 18th century. He lived among this time of the scientific enlightenment. But I think I have to give Swedenborg some credit there. It's like there are these things which inhabit evil. I don't get where Emerson's coming from, that if everything's on its way to good, well, like, what's your criteria for conversion? Emerson stuff seems so vague to me. Just just needlessly optimistic, naively optimistic? I don't know. But it's interesting as well. The method of the mystic is what I titled this, and that conviction that the mystic has, the philosopher doesn't, is one of the things that stands out. We've mentioned it before, and I think there was a line here that the mystic can come in and have an effect on the statesman more directly than the philosopher, where he says, literally, this is the line you alluded to earlier, that theoretic or speculative man, but whom no practical man in the universe could affect to scorn. Plato is a gownsman. His garment, though purple and almost sky-woven, is an academic robe and hinders action with its voluminous folds. But this mystic is awful to Caesar, like Lycurgus himself would bow. So the more traditional great men, like Lycurgus and Caesar, still kind of bow to a mystic. And I think of the court astrologer or something like this. Give me some portents before this battle, that where the great man will still seek out this mystic or someone who they believe is in tune to what's going to happen next, or in tune with either the stars or the earth, or in Swedenborg's case, a more Hebraic heaven and hell. What did you think about that? I think the mystic has this effect on the statesman, whereas the philosopher doesn't.
Well, what I think of when I think of a mystic affecting a statesman is something that Emerson alluded to as the greatest idea that Swedenborg has put forth, which was that in the end, while you're going through life and so forth, when you're going through difficulties, what will get you out of it is neither strategies, common sense, or any of what we think of when we think of how to traverse the best way within our lives. He says that what will get us, what will help us win, is the idea of following righteousness, which is kind of in religion. And this is the exact quote he's talking about that. Let me see if I have the most beautiful. I mean, I have the quote. It's just that it's a very fragmented. Anyhow, he elected goodness as the clue which the soul must cling in. He elected goodness as the clue to which the soul must cling in all this labyrinth of nature. Many opinions conflict as to the true center. In the shipwreck, some cling to the running rigging, some to cask and barrel, some to spars, some to mast. The pilot chooses with science. I plant myself here. All will sink before this. He comes to land who sails with me. Do not rely on heavenly favor, or on compassion to folly, or on prudence, on common sense, the old usage and main chance of man. Nothing can keep you. Not fate, not health, nor admirable intellect. None can keep you, but rectitude only. Rectitude forever and ever. So this is what Emerson thinks the greatest idea that Swedenborg has put forth. That in the end, it's not about how much you have, how well tactics that you discovered, or how well you achieved something. It's about whether or not you were on the righteous path. So in that sense, I think the statesman following the philosopher is because the statesman knows that, Caesar knows that he can make a better tactic, or like a better war tactic, or just a better way of running the state than the mystic. But he also knows that the mystic has that righteous spark that will lead him to salvation, whereas his tactics and his different developed modes of thinking would not. So that's what
the mystic gives him
the statesman,
the moral purpose for his actions. Yeah, I know I'm a great strategist and I can win this battle, but I need to have the understanding of why I'm winning this battle, and the mystic can provide that. Certainly in antiquity, they did, and that led me to think, who is the modern analogous to the mystic? For me, it's then like we talked about the difference between mysticism and science. The scientific advisor has become that role to the statesman today, where the statesman himself mightn't understand much of what the scientific advisor is tackling with, but he's looking for the nod, the point in the right direction, particularly with pandemic and all of that. Well, like, he doesn't know about immunology or any of this, the statesman, but he needs to talk to scientific advisors, similar to how a Caesar will try and find, because they need that. Well, is it giving them moral? In a way, it is giving them moral justice.
Yeah,
because they're like, well, the science points towards it. That's saying.
Especially in the pandemic, they are using morals as literally their AK-47 in just putting all of their ideas about lockdown into place. When they're telling people that they're shutting down their businesses, they are using morals as their weapon to say that we are not just being sort of these hypocritical people that will not be, we as the statesmen will not be in trouble because of the laws that we put out, but a lot of people will lose their livelihoods because of them. But we have the moral high ground, you see. We're actually we know better than you, and that you need to follow our moral righteous path, or else you will fall into evil, and you don't want to fall into evil, do you? I mean, it's kind of the notion you hear of, like.
It was interesting, though, just to think of, like, well, the modern equivalent of that, it has to be the scientific advisor. I am in tune with something you're not. Let me direct you. That's kind of like what a court astrologer would do on the eve of a battle to a king.
Yeah, in that sense, although...
And they give invariable method and order, right? That's Emerson's word. A mystic can give invariable method and order to something that a statesman needs to do.
Yeah, and you can actually make the argument that although we might have, lost the sort of the poetic edge to science and the immediate just grappling with facts like we have at foot and centimeter, you can make the argument that with the use of media and sort of like this big solidifying scientific powers, you can actually sort of be that mystic that makes the moral decision for a city, maybe even to a bigger extent than someone who is just advising Caesar, for instance. But yeah, that's a way bigger topic to like discuss than we can do in like 2 or 3 minutes that we have left. So I think we should talk about at the very end Emerson's sort of disclaimer. I want to talk about that.
Yeah, go
Let me
for
just
it.
quickly quote.
I have some of those quotes as well. Yeah, where he kind of lays into Swedenborg.
This isn't the whole paragraph, but it's basically the gist of it. These books should be used with caution. It is dangerous to sculpture these evanescing images of thought. True in transition, they become false if fixed. It requires, for his apprehension, almost a genius equal to his own. So in that sense, Emerson is saying, okay, look, if you're not smart enough to understand this, then you shouldn't try to apply it. It's almost what he says. It requires a genius equal to his own. And he also says, like, he goes on in later parts of that paragraph to say that, you shouldn't just stereotype it according to what you think it means. You should actually study the context in which it appeared. And I was reading this and I thought, like, hold on a second, Emerson. Don't you always say that, the Dante of the 5, when he first wrote it, as opposed to how we read Dante now, is inconsequential, is of inconsequential importance, because you read Dante nowadays and you have a completely different notion, at least somewhat different notion than someone who reads it when it was first written in the 1400s or 1300s. So in Emerson's view, that was all right, because that's what text should be, especially if a text were to survive. if a text were to survive, it needed to be able to be interpreted in so many different ways and interpreted in so many different interpreted by so many different brains, for instance. And he makes that distinction with Dante, not in any particular essay, as far as I know, but I did read that book I mentioned a few weeks ago about Emerson's writing. And Emerson actually considered that, you don't have to go into the context of what something is written, because if something is written for all time, then you don't need the context. It can mean something to you even while you're reading it now. And I'm thinking, as far as, Swedenborg, no one really knows of it. That's why we don't even have him on the title. And Emerson also makes this wonderful little observation that he thinks, maybe he won't survive Swedenborg as like this big figure as he is right now, considering that, he was right on point. He says, I think sometimes he will not be read longer. His great name will turn a sentence. His books have become a monument. His laurel, so largely mixed with cypress, a charnel breath so mingles with the temple incense, that boys and maids will shun the spot. He makes a different argument. I think he says his name will be so exalted that people wouldn't want to deal with him. I don't know. You can make that argument about.
Well, we're bringing Swedenborg back, baby.
Yeah, we're sort of bringing him back. But he does say that he thinks that they might not have the longevity that he sees in many other texts. He doesn't make this observation about any other writer, as far as I know, especially within representative men. So,
it's an interesting point you made on Dante, though. Dante's Inferno is he goes through hell. How similar is that to Swedenborg's own experiences, right? Because Dante wrote it in a poem. Suddenly he's a poet rather than a mystic. And Swedenborg, we're happy to read it as a poet. I know when we get to the poet in the Great Men, we're going to talk about Dante a bit with Carlyle. I'm not sure how much. How much does Emerson bring in Dante, or does he kind of avoid Dante? I can't remember.
No, I believe he says Shakespeare and Dante.
Okay, so it'll be interesting to see how it takes him, because here he does not like the idea of Swedenborg going into communicating with devils and demons. How does he interpret the Inferno of Dante in the context of that? Will he brush that in the same way? I don't know if you have any other parting thoughts. I have some of the some quotes from Emerson laid on when he's trying to say, here's kind of where I don't really trust Swedenborg. They're good quotes overall. They're not necessarily pertaining to Swedenborg, where he says, the slippery Proteus, that of what you're really trying to achieve when you probe even beyond the scientific enlightenment, that probing of nature, which I think he finds admirable in Swedenborg, the fact he tried. But he says the slippery Proteus is not so easily caught. And I thought that was a lovely allusion to Proteus. If you capture Proteus, he has to tell you the truth. But he'll slip and change into loads of different shapes before you do that. And you need to have the conviction to hold on to him until he does so. And I think here he thinks Swedenborg hasn't grabbed that Proteus. He hasn't grabbed that truth. Because another quote by Emerson, he says, the secret of heaven is kept from age to age. It's not ever going to be for us to fully understand and grasp. And when Swedenborg says, I've been to heaven, I've been to hell, it's at that point which Emerson goes, you've lost me.
Yeah, and he does.
The glory was too bright for his eyes to bear. That's another quote.
Yeah, he does constantly allude to the notion that Swedenborg's writing didn't contain any poetry or any grace or any kind of individuality, which is another criticism he throws at Swedenborg, because he thinks that individuality needs to exist there for each and every character and every facet of nature that you're talking about, so that what you're writing becomes alive, and I get the notion that you're actually giving me the truth. And he feels like that is lacking in the sort of generalist outlook that Swedenborg has into what he's interpreting from the world. And maybe that relates to his more scientifically setup, brain.
The framework in which
Maybe.
is operating.
Yeah.
All
So, that's all we have to say about Swedenborg, the most famous philosopher ever talked about by Emerson.
Mystic. He's a mystic. He's not a philosopher.
Mystic.
Get it right, son. So to Emerson, metaphysics should be something immersive, not something mesmeric, not something you get infatuated by.
Yeah.
And so I'll leave it on that. Till next time, guys. Next time is
Skeptic. Montaigne the Skeptic.
Yeah,
We'll
Michel de
be going
Montaigne.
into how skepticism is better than philosophy and poetry.
All right. See you next time.